Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to start the section on the American Revolution. Now, we cannot talk about the American Revolution until we talk about the French and Indian War, so that's going to come first. And this all starts with competition for North American colonies. Conflict between the great European empires spread to the American colonies throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The British and the colonists fought a series of wars against the French and their American Indian allies. In the process, however, the relationship between the British and their colonies became strained, and we all know what this strain is going to lead to. By the mid-18th century, England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands were locked in a worldwide struggle for empire. In North America, Britain's greatest rival was France. While Britain controlled numerous colonies on the Atlantic seaboard, France controlled a vast territory that extended from the St. Lawrence River to the Gulf of Mexico. Between 1689 and 1748, the British and the French fought a series of wars. Most of the fighting took place in Europe, but some spilled over into North America. Before long, British colonists were drawn into the war. Okay, we have a map here that is going to show who owns what territory at this time. Now, if we look down here in the corner, we have the key where the light blue section, or I guess it's more of a purple, that section is British territory. And we see here the part that is labeled Appalachian Mountains is in this light purple. That is the British territory. They also own some of the islands off of what is today Canada and the north around the Hudson Bay. Now, the vast majority of what is today America and Canada was owned by the French. This was all French territory. And all of this green down below is Spanish territory. Now, if this map went down further and showed more of South America, you would see more green territory down there. But for now, what we are worried about is just what is going to become, as we know it today, as the United States. So, we see that while France controls more territory, it's actually the British territory that is more valuable because of its access to the ocean. Europeans compete for American Indian allies. Each war between England and France was followed by a great treaty that resolved nothing. Great Britain longed to drive the French from North America, and to accomplish this, the British needed to neutralize the great French advantage, French support for most of the American Indians in the region. American Indians dominated the forest passages between the frontiers of the rival empires. So yeah, in what is today the United States, back in this time, it was mostly British and French who were the European powers in what is today America at this time. So whenever they were fighting, they would want to draw the Native Americans to their side. And as we're going to see, there's one side that is better at this. It's the French. And we're going to see why France is so much better at drawing in Native American allies. This lithograph depicts a conference between the French and a group of American Indians in about 1750. How would you describe the relationship between the French and the American Indian leaders? Now, just from looking at this picture, we can look at the people in this picture, and as you notice, there's something missing. There's something missing that you might expect to see here. Weapons. Aside from this one Native American man who appears to have maybe an axe of some sort or some sort of long-handled tool here, there are no weapons in this picture. Now, he does have that, but I feel that he's sitting next to the fire here, so maybe that's more of a fire poker or something. But the French, the Europeans here on the left, none of them seem to be ready for battle. All of the Native Americans on the other side here, none of them have brought weapons or tools or anything. You know, they aren't dressed in a way that I would think is very good for a conflict. As you can see here, this is a peaceful meeting. They're talking. It appears that this Native American man here is maybe presenting a gift of some sort. So as we can see here, it's a peaceful meeting. They just seem to be talking. There's no sign of a fight, no sign of a conflict, and that is not something that can be said about many of the British interactions with the Native Americans. The American Indians benefited from their middle position between the competing empires. The British and French both gave generous gifts, especially of arms and ammunition, to woo the American Indians. If one empire wanted total victory, the American Indians would lose their leverage and receive harsher treatment from the victors. The Iroquois, for example, were also aware that the land that they lived on was at stake. Now, here's a quote from the Iroquois leader. "We know our lands are now become more valuable. The white people think we do not know their value, but we are sensible that the land is everlasting, and the few goods we receive for it are soon worn out and gone. Besides, we are not well used with respect to the lands still unsold by us. Your people daily settle on these lands and spoil our hunting. Your horses and cows have eaten the grass our deer used to feed on." And that is a quote from Canasatigo, the Iroquois leader, in July 7th, 1742. The American Indians were aware that preserving a balance of power between the French and the British was important. So, the American Indians are going to benefit from having both the French and the British in the Americas. Because if they can play them against each other, each side is going to try to win them over with gifts and, paying them and giving them guns and ammunition and food and things like that, that they're going to get a benefit by having these two trying to compete for their alliance. However, if one side wins and completely drives out the other side, well, that's going to be a problem for the natives. Okay, let's look at this chart for just a moment. British and French interaction with American Indians. On the British side, we have experienced higher levels of violence in their dealings with American Indians, justified taking Indian lands for religious and economic reasons, and favored segregation between themselves and the Indians. So as you can see, the British aren't having a great relationship with the natives. The French are going to have a much easier time winning their allegiance. The French experienced lower levels of violence in their dealings with the Indians, focused more on establishing trade with Indians than settlement, and favored intermarriage between themselves and the Indians. So the French are actively working to foster a good relationship with the natives. If you think back to what we talked about, what each side used their territory in the Americas for, the French mostly used their territory in the Americas for trapping, hunting, trading. The French really didn't have a lot of big cities and towns and things that they established, whereas the British came here to establish towns, establish cities, forts, that sort of thing. Now, if we look in the middle, we see that both the British and the French tried to gain the loyalty of Indians through gifts and attempted to convert Indians to Christianity. So, while they both did that, the French are having a much easier time getting these allies. The British colonies grow stronger. That balance began to tip as the British colonial population grew. In 1754, the 1.5 million British colonists greatly outnumbered the 70,000 French. The increasingly powerful British often treated the American Indians harshly and did little to stop settlers from taking Indian lands. Compared to the British, the French were more restrained. Needing American Indian allies, the French treated most American Indians with respect and generosity. The outnumbered French worked with their American Indian allies to resist British colonial expansion. The French built a string of small forts and trading posts along the Great Lakes and down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Lightly built and thinly manned, the posts depended upon American Indians for protection. Most American Indians accepted these posts because, as one chief explained, "We can drive away the French when we please." That was not true of the British. Yet, while most American Indians supported the French, some fought for the British. So there are going to be Native Americans on both sides. I'm not saying that all Native Americans were on the side of the French. I'm not saying that none were on the side of the British. There are going to be some on both sides. One point of conflict between France and Great Britain was the fertile Ohio River Valley. Do you know where the Ohio River Valley is? I hope so, because it's all around you. It's where we live. Which was claimed by both countries, but was largely unsettled. To discourage British colonists from moving into this area known as the Ohio Country, the French built Fort Duquesne in what is now western Pennsylvania. An important British victory. A young George Washington led British troops against the French in 1754. This is what George Washington looked like whenever he was younger. I know whenever we think of George Washington, keep that guy in mind. He might do something a little important here in just a few sections. We think about him as first president, the founder of our country. But, he did have a life before America, and he was a British officer. So this is what he looked like when he was younger. The new fort angered the British governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie. In 1754, he sent colonial troops to evict the French. Dinwiddie entrusted the command to a young, ambitious Virginian named George Washington. Remember, keep that guy's name in mind. Washington's troops attacked and defeated a small French force, but Washington had to surrender when the French counterattacked. His defeat touched off a world war that eventually spread from America to Europe, Asia, Africa, and the West Indies. In Europe, the war was called the 7 Years' War. The British colonists called the conflict the French and Indian War, after the French and their American Indian allies. The British struggled at first. At first, the British fared poorly in North America. In 1755, a combined British and colonial force did overwhelm 2 French forts near Nova Scotia. Those troops evicted the French settlers known as Acadians and gave their farms to New Englanders. But the British army suffered a disastrous defeat when General Edward Braddock marched into a French and Indian ambush near Fort Duquesne. Braddock died, but Washington led a skillful retreat that saved half of that army. Later, Washington recalled the battle in a letter to his mother. We were attacked by a body of French and Indians, whose number, I am certain, did not exceed 300 men. Ours consisted of about 1,300 well-armed troops, chiefly of the English soldiers, who were struck with such a panic that they behaved with more cowardice than it is possible to conceive. The officers behaved gallantly in order to encourage their men, for which they suffered greatly, there being near 60 killed and wounded, a large proportion out of the number we had. George Washington, 1755. So in this attack, they were taken by surprise, and he says that they were struck with such a panic that they behaved with more cowardice than it is possible to conceive, meaning they were scared. They were taken by surprise. This was an ambush. This was a surprise attack. And a lot of people, they panicked. They broke formation. And George Washington was able to get his troops back together, to rally the troops together so that they would come back under command. And he suffered a lot of killed and wounded in this attack. Okay guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. I hope you are having a good day, and I'll see you again real soon.